Hello, everybody. My name is Taylor, and today I will be talking about Chapter 3 of Children's Lively Minds. Going into this chapter, I thought I had a solid understanding of play-based learning. But what stood out to me is that this chapter doesn't just describe play, it reframes it. It challenges us to look at children's actions not just as random or simple, but as meaningful, repeated patterns that are actually driving development. My biggest aha moment was realizing that repetition in children's play is not accidental, it's essential. That repetition is almost like a child's way of running experiments. They're testing, adjusting, and learning all through doing. This chapter emphasizes that children engage in repeated actions to explore the materials, and that completely shifted my perspective. Instead of seeing repetition as boredom or lack of direction, I now see it as a form of deep engagement and investigation. So, what is a schema? Schemas can be understood as patterns in how children interact with their environment. They're not isolated behaviors, but an ongoing process that helps children organize their thinking. What I found interesting is that schemas are not taught directly. Children develop them naturally through exploration, which really supports the idea of child-led learning. Children use schemas everywhere, and we have to come to recognize that schemas motivate and support children's learning in many domains. This quote really captures the central argument of the chapter. Schemas are not limited to one area like art or math. They're happening across all domains of learning. This connects to the idea that learning isn't separated into subjects for children. It's all integrated through their experiences. This made me realize that when we observe children, we're not just seeing isolated skills, we're seeing interconnected development. What stood out to me is how consistent these patterns are across different contexts. For example, a child drawing circles repeatedly is exploring circularity. A child filling and emptying containers is exploring enclosure. A child rolling cars is exploring trajectory. These actions may look simple, but they reflect complex thinking. What's interesting is that the same schema can show up in completely different activities, which shows how flexible children's thinking really is. This section challenged how I think about children's artwork and made me think about how often adults try to interpret children's art literally, when it's actually more about the process rather than the product. The chapter pushes back against the idea that early art is random. Instead, it suggests that children are intentionally exploring patterns, movement, and space. This made me reconsider how often adults underestimate the meaning behind children's creations. This chapter connected directly to the experience I shared last week in the TK classroom that I'm interning at. I was working with a child who was struggling to match pictures to the letter G. And instead of giving him the answer, I guided him with questions like, what sound does the letter G make? Over time, he began to independently apply that thinking pattern and work through the problems himself. By the end, he wasn't just learning the letter G, he was learning how to think through a problem, which is way more valuable long term. However, my own educational experiences were somewhat different from what this chapter describes. There was often a focus on doing things the right way, which sometimes limits opportunities for open-ended exploration. Repetitive behaviors were often redirected rather than encouraged, and this made me reflect on how different environments shape how children are allowed to learn, and how important it is to create space for exploration. One insight I didn't expect was how schemas support social interaction. The chapter explains that children recognize patterns in each other's play, and they use that as a way to connect. Even without strong verbal communication, they are able to collaborate through shared actions. And this highlights that schemas are not just cognitive, they're also social. These are some questions I've been thinking about after reading this chapter. When does repetition become productive learning? How do we respond to play that looks chaotic? Are we allowing enough space for exploration? I think these questions are important because they push us to reflect on our roles as educators, not just what we teach, but how we respond to children's natural ways of learning. Here are my references for the chapter, and thank you everybody for listening. Have a great night.